talk this morning. It's very like informative and very good and everything.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Yeah. You talk about colonialism, specifically in your book, The New Age of Empire. Is that confined to the transatlantic slave trade, or does it also include Indian slavery as well?
Yeah, no, so definitely there's a big focus on slavery and transatlantic slave trade. It's really important, but it's just one aspect of colonialism and empire. And if you think about the British Empire, it's 24% of the world's population. It's this huge empire, which India is massively important to that. Even further to that, you go Hong Kong's or Malaysia, Africa. So no, slavery is definitely like a huge part of empire and colonialism, but the whole, and Britain's not the only place. So the French Empire, Spanish Empire, etc., etc. It's a global system with different dimensions to it.
So within teaching like Black Studies and Black History at schools, do you think that there's any age groups and specific years that we should teach it to, and would that focus on more of Black cultural history, or like you were talking about earlier, the colonial history of Britain?
I mean, I think there's never too young to learn about any of it. I think because it's so violent, I think some of the, especially something like slavery, and there's a lot of people who say, well, look, should you teach slavery to younger people? And the way that I learned slavery actually wasn't from school. We never didn't learn a single thing about slavery in school. It was at home, and we learned figures like Nanny of the Maroons, who was a really important figure in Jamaica. She was taken into slavery in Ghana, but she was like high up in the Ashanti kingdom, and she escaped when she was in Jamaica and ran to the hills. And in the hills in Jamaica, because of the way that Spain first had the island and had enslaved Africans, and then Britain took the island off Spain, when the British came, the Africans who were enslaved by Spain ran into the hills basically. And since 1655, there's been this free community of black people in Jamaica. And so Nanny joins the Maroons and organises the Maroons, becomes really important in terms of fighting back against the British. It took 6 of her guerrilla forces to beat a whole battalion of the British, never surrendered. And that's how I learned slavery. So when people talk about slavery as negative, I'm like, oh, I don't know what you mean, right? And like, there's so many different stories like that about resistance. So it really just depends what it is you're telling, how you're telling it. So I tell that story to my 2-year-old. As soon as they can understand, they're going to learn about that stuff. So you can teach all of it, and you can teach it as young as possible. It's just obviously for younger kids you enhance certain bits, but we shouldn't be protecting them from racism, because even as a 3-year-old, you're going to experience it, so they need to understand.
What do you think are the effects of British imperialism today, and why do you think it's so important we recognise them?
What are the effects of British? Everything is the effect of British imperialism. It's impossible to understate that the British, and Britain was an empire, it was not a nation. Britain is still an empire in many ways. And so all the wealth that we have and the progress and the key touchstones of history, whether that is Industrial Revolution, World Wars, whatever, the NHS, the England football team, whatever it is, all of those things are imperial, because Britain is an empire. And the biggest problem we have with understanding Britain is we teach Britain as though it's this nation state, the island. And so you should stop doing that, right? We should actually teach Britain properly. And if you teach Britain properly, then everything's imperial. And that's negative, deeply, because of extraction. But then also that's, I guess, positive in a sense, because it gives us a connection to the nation. So if we're thinking about, like the Windrush scandal, for example, where Caribbean people, and not just Caribbean people, but colonial subjects are being arrested, are being deported, are being stopped from getting jobs. That would never happen if we understood that Britain was an empire and all these people were contributing to Britain just as much as anybody else in Britain. Never would have happened, right? So, no, everything's imperial, and that's how we should understand it.
Yeah, so you led the creation of the first Black Studies degree in the UK, at Birmingham City, which is incredible. I was wondering what that process was like, and kind of how that came to be, and what led you to that in the first place?
Yeah, so we did Black Studies at Birmingham City University. It was 2017, the very first Black Studies degree, the only Black Studies degree in Europe, actually, which tells you about racism. I mean, so one of the things is demographics. So because slavery and colonialism is at a distance, even though hundreds of millions of Indian people really are part of Britain, they're not actually in Britain, they're in India, so it's separate. And so demographically, it's only recently that Britain's had any significant number of minorities, whereas compared to America, there's black people in America before there are most white people, and racism is such an important part of that foundation. You can't really avoid it. So that it makes sense that black studies is in America, whereas here we're only 3% of the population today, and if you look at staffing wise, only about 1% of academic staff are black. Higher up it gets even worse. So I'm one of 150 black professors in the entire country. I have 20,000 professors. There's 150 black professors, which means that we're not all allowed to get on a plane together just in case there's an accident and there'll be no black professors. Right? that's how bad it is. So it's so racist that it's so narrow, and a lot of the problems we talk about. I come to schools and we can criticize the schools, but really, where do schools get their knowledge from? They get it from university. Teachers are trained in universities. So all the deficits that you see in the schools are from the fact that universities are just white in terms of knowledge. And so that passes down to the schools. So we started Black Studies because there's a critical mass of us now saying actually we have to do things differently. We have a complete different intellectual heritage because there hasn't really been black academics. The knowledge that we have comes through community. So, Malcolm X is my absolute favourite. Best philosopher for me in the 20th century. Doesn't finish school, let alone university. And that kind of insurgent community knowledge is what the knowledge is that we brought into the academy. And that's important to do. But we were only able to do it. I mean, as I was saying about the different staff, like we have 7 black members of staff in our department, which is sociology, criminology. And it's so unheard of. Like, we have more black members of staff in our one department than most universities just have, full stop. Like, that's how bad it is. But we were able to do that because mostly through luck, to be honest. I started 8 years ago. And there was me and one of the black members of staff. But we'd done Black Studies as a research thing first. So international conferences, books, stuff like this. And I just came in and said, look, we're doing Black Studies. And we are going to do research on Black Studies. That is going to be what we're doing. And every time we get a job, we need someone who can contribute to our research, which is Black Studies. And so because of that, we hired a number of black people in succession and black PhD students, etc., and created a space where you could have a whole course on Black Studies. But it is literally the only place that could possibly remotely do it because most universities don't have any black people. I have one black person, right? So in order to get the degree, we had to first do all of that work, research work, get the staff in. And then when we had the staff, it was relatively straightforward, just because the universities are businesses. And when I told the university, look, we're the only place that can do this, and they were like, oh, great, yeah, we can charge £9,000 for it, of course you can do Black Studies. So actually getting the actual course was way more simple at that level, but it took so many years of actually getting the people in the place, because that was I could tell you some horror stories about trying to hire black people, particularly black women. It's very difficult to hire black women in universities, but we managed it. But it was a long process.
Is black feminism included in any aspect of the Black Studies course that you teach at the city?
Yeah, so the strands, black feminism is one of the central strands. I mean, the strands would be politics, community engagement, so the students have to go and do work in the community. Popular culture is a massive part of Black Studies, and black feminism. So from first year, second year, third year, we have a master's now. Black feminism is the most developed academic part of Black Studies, probably. Think about the idea of intersectionality, which has become a thing which people don't talk about it very well usually, but they do at least talk about it. Patricia Hill Collins, people like that, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks. So yeah, it's fundamentally important as a way of, because you think about what Black Studies, the understanding of the universal through the particular, actually those particular experiences of black women are really important because of the intersection of gender and race and what that tells us. So yeah, black feminism absolutely central to the work that we're doing.
So you did your PhD in sociology as well as cultural studies. Does that tie in with the course at all, or does that influence the way you teach?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So so I did my master's and PhD in the remnants of the old Centre for Contemporary Culture Studies in Birmingham. That's important because Professor Stuart Hall, who's late Jamaican scholar, who really pioneered a different way to do cultural studies. Because cultural studies is still now, and before then was really quite an elite. You look at particular texts and books, and he was saying actually, popular culture is really important, and particularly if you're talking about black people, we're not allowed into the elite. So you're just not, if you're just studying elite literature, you're never gonna get no black people because they're not there, right? So he's saying actually no, you have to look at popular culture, the way the music is done, the way the media works, as legitimate sources of engagement, and that's a massive part that goes through our work, and definitely I'd say that's probably influenced by Stuart Hall and some of the stuff we've done with the degree. I think in terms of generally the degree is located in sociology and criminology, so there is a bent more towards like sociological stuff. Actually, half the degree is sociology, because so many of our staff are black anyway. We do black studies. Our actual sociology is quite black studies, so we've managed to combine quite a lot of the modules are kind of sociology / black studies combined with the more core black studies. I think my studying, in many ways, it does influence, because like, I look at structure and look at society and look at, my work's largely politics, but I'd say having studied at the University of Birmingham and had that degree, I also know what not to do in a very real way. And so a lot of that is just rejecting that framework and doing things very, 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 very differently. Like the core concepts in terms of blackness are just different. It's not the same as sociology. In fact, I actually started off as a sociologist. My job was I was associate professor. I only became professor of black studies recently. Before that, all my titles were sociology. Used to go to sociology conferences, but I don't anymore. Honestly, I've left it completely because just so much of the conceptual stuff we're doing is different. The way we think about blackness is not race, is very different to that. The way we do research isn't in the kind of typical way where you just go and research people and leave. It's really engaged in communities. So in some ways, yeah, I guess my training, I like to push back against my training quite a lot, I guess.
Could you talk a little about the Harambee organisation of Black Unity that you founded and what actions they take to support black communities?
Yeah, so my work, academic work, is Black Radicalism, my first book. Second book was Back to Black, looked at black radical theory. And one of the things I push back against my training is that this idea that your research should be kind of value free, or you should be not objective. We don't say objective, even socialists don't say objective anymore, but the idea you shouldn't really be part of it, you should be separate from is a really philosophical problem with Western research. Whereas black studies is the opposite. So no, of course you should be in it with black. Like our job here is not just to tell you what the problem is. I mean, we know what the problems are. They're pretty obvious. The question is, how do we solve the problems? And so the Harambee Organisation Black Unity is a combination of two different organisations. One is a Harambee organisation that started in 1972. My dad actually started the Harambee organisation, and it did. There was a nursery, the Marcus Garvey Nursery. There was the Harriet Tubman Bookshop. There was the Harambee House Hostel. They had legal advice and loads of stuff in the 70s. And then my dad left that organisation, became a criminal defence lawyer. Organisation went down into the ground basically, so we came back on board in 2013 to try and save it. Alongside that, we started the Organisation of Black Unity, which is based on Malcolm X's Organisation of Afro-American Unity, and basically it's a platform for black radical politics, where it says you organise, you get members to join, you have a department of health, education, economics, we sit down and work out what we're doing together, and then we organise. So we connected these two organisations together because Harambee had buildings, resources and that, and we've just relaunched the organisation now with the Marcus Garvey Centre in Handsworth in Birmingham. And the idea is we're going to run educational programs, we're going to set up a health department, we're going to basically be a place to coordinate stuff in the black community. And we also have a website you might be interested in called Make It Plain, which is a place where just stuff we can write about, different ideas, different thoughts, different topics. And it's already up there, make-it-plain.org, and you can just read some of the stuff that we're doing.
Is that like focused in Birmingham?
So the kind of headquarters is in Birmingham, and there's a lot of work because we've got a building in Birmingham, 2 buildings in Birmingham. But we also have members from around the country, and now especially because of lockdown, we did lots of things online. And the idea is you want to start more chapters. So there's a Birmingham chapter, but you have different chapters as well. So we definitely want more people to be involved around the country and the world, basically.
Yeah, cool. So you said that Malcolm X is your inspiration, and his organisation influenced that. What are some of his ideas that you adopt within your own views of civil rights? So, for example, his views on separatism and Pan-Africanism, stuff like that.
Basically, everything Malcolm says, but I'm kind of joking, but not really, because if you actually look at New Age of Empire, Back to Black in particular, it essentially does what did Malcolm say, but let me explain it in a different way. And I'm actually writing a book next book, one book, is going to be The Social Theory of Malcolm X. I'm going to time it to his birthday because he'll be 100 years old in 2025. So I'm going to try and time it for that and do like a social theory of Malcolm X. And Malcolm, I mean, so much of it. I mean, the solution and the problem and the solution. So the quote, I think I don't know, I can give you so many Malcolm X quotes. I can give you all, I'm not going to do it. But I think one that sticks with me is, this system can no more provide freedom, justice and equality for black people than a chicken can lay a duck egg. Like, it's just not meant to do it, right? And once we understand that, once you really think, actually, this is like, because that tells us that when we're looking at all this, like 21st century, Black Lives Matter, look at the map of global inequality, it is no better today than it was 100 years ago. I mean, it really isn't. And this is why, like, Malcolm is very much not a civil rights activist. Like, you always say Malcolm's civil rights. Malcolm, there's no time for civil rights. Because what he was saying was, is you can't reform this system. It's not broken. This is what it's meant to do, right? It is like asking a chicken to lay a duck egg, asking the system to value black life. And so, because of that, you just stop. Like, you just say, stop, let's go. We have to do something else. And that's really important, because then it says, well, let's turn the focus and we have to organize and create the alternatives. And Malcolm really is a Garveyite, effectively a Marcus Garvey, Universal Negro Improvement Association. It's problematic for many ways in terms of separatism and race. And this is problematic. But where he got it right, and this is what Malcolm basically takes up, is this idea that we should stop looking to whatever nation state we reside as being our identity, right? Like, I'm not British. I'm British. I contribute to Britain, but I have a British passport. But my fate is not tied. My fate, if I see my fate tied to Britain, then I've lost automatically. But Malcolm's saying we should see our fate tied to each other. The black nation, that's our fate. So when we're building an organization, it's an organization that cuts across America, cuts across the Caribbean, cuts across Africa, and says, look, black consciousness, the idea that we solve our problems and we come together as a black African and black diaspora connected to Africa, that's the solution. And that's the kind of this idea of the global black nation, which ignores nation state borders and says that we organize collectively as each other. And that really is a solution. Because if you actually look at like, for instance, when Europeans come into Africa, they're behind Africa. Africa is actually quite advanced in comparison to Europe. Europe, the biggest lie anybody ever tells you is that Europe takes over the world because they're just better. Not true. Europe is behind, and it is exploitation, it is the West, it is the genocide, it is slavery that brings Europe up to this point where Europe is then predominant, right? And when Europe comes into Africa, if Africa had black consciousness, like as in we are going to organize together as a unit, slavery just simply doesn't happen. It simply cannot happen. But it's because we don't see ourselves that we actually, there's this tribe, and there's this kingdom, and there's this, and then we're pitted against each other, and then we'll sell to you, and we're totally, that's what leads to our downfall, basically. And if you look today, it's no different, where you have a continent of Africa which is split up, literally chopped up by Europeans. Like, how can you say you're a Ghanaian or a Nigerian? These are European constructs. And what they do is they keep us at each other, at loggerheads with each other, right? Or I'm a Jamaican. Like, these are nonsense in terms, right? If we understood that those need to go, and we should see ourselves as black consciousness, organize a unit, we could solve our problems really, 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 really quickly. And again, that's something you get from Malcolm. Malcolm very, very, very clearly pushes that idea.
You've said that universities, including Birmingham City, are like institutionally racist. I'm just wondering if there's like been any like progress in Birmingham City University since then, or like what can be done to improve that?
Okay, because I get paid by Birmingham City University. but honestly, and I'm very honest about this. Since I got made professor, it's been worse. Not better. It's terrible. The uni ain't changed, and it hasn't changed one bit, right? This is why I say to people, like, we are not decolonizing the university. We are not. We have put something in it. We have colonized the university, to use the European language, where because of critical mass, because of particular pressure, because it looks good, because we've played the game correctly, we've created a space where it's very different, where the student experience is different, where you're teaching different things, you learn different. It's completely different if you come into black studies. That has not changed the university at all, in any meaningful way at all. I still experience the same race as my experience before, and like I said, actually being a professor, you probably feel it more because you're more of a target. You're more, especially when you're public. You just get. I've had more problems in the last 4 years than I had prior to any time in the university, because the institutions are the problem. Like, they really are. And Birmingham City University isn't a elite institution. Like, so sometimes we would think you wouldn't have those issues, but they're just as prevalent at my university as they are somewhere else. And if you look at things like the attainment gap, where you are significantly less likely to get a good degree if you're ethnic minority, most of our faculty is ethnic minority students. We have a lot of ethnic minority staff actually. That still holds. It's still the case. It's still the case in our faculty, in our uni, in our place, which supposedly is more progressive as a black studies. You still have this massive problem with the attainment gap. So that's telling you there's something institutional. It's not about the individuals. It's about the way that the university works. And honestly, that hasn't gotten slightly better at all. Unfortunately.
Yeah, so we kind of already touched on this, but if the system is institutionally racist, what is the solution? How can we change that?
We need a new system, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is the thing which it sounds insane, right? And now because we're definitely in a worse position now than we were 50 years ago. Because 50 years ago, if someone had came to you and said, look, we need a revolution, we need a new system, you'd have said, yeah, it's possible. Like, we'd have gone, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like, you have there's Pan-Africanism, there's communism, there's other alternatives which are happening at this time, right? And what happened 50 years ago is there was lots of violence, so lots of people got killed, there was just put down. In fact, I was reading a book, what's it called? The Jakarta Method, which I definitely recommend to read, because I hadn't really thought about this. The idea of the Cold War, and we think about the Cold War, there was no violence, it was just like a standoff. Complete nonsense. They were murdering communists around the black and brown world, like just millions of people just gone because they were a threat to the Western order. Like there really was, like 50 years ago, it was a doubt as to whether capitalism would survive. Like a proper doubt. It was in the balance because of all these movements in the third world. And the violence that was unleashed, it is insane when you really think about it. And again, not really discussed. But the other thing that happened was, alongside the violence, there was concessions got made. Right? So it's not a coincidence you get independence. Have your own government. We'll still control the economy. We'll still take all the wealth, but you can have your government. Racial relations acts, like in the UK. Yeah, you can be a black professor, but you're still going to experience racism. You're still going to have the youth unemployment rate in the UK is just as bad today as it was in 1981. It hasn't changed. It's just as bad, right? But there's black people on TV, so we feel better, right? There's all these concessions. You have a black president, but look at the situation of black people more broadly in America. So now when you say to people, look, we need something else, people generally think that things have progressed, things have changed, and it's such a problem. So no, look, the only solution to this is to build a new political and economic system, and it's not impossible. Like, the West is actually relatively young. Like, it's only a couple hundred years where it's been predominant, and that's why Malcolm makes it plain. Like, we have to do something else if we want to continue. And also, it's not just, I can make this argument about race, but think about the constant idea of consumption and wealth. What is it that's killing the whole planet? That's what's killing the whole planet, right? This pursuit of supremacy. It's going to kill all of us. If we don't do something else, there will be no planet left. So hopefully, that's the wake-up call for everybody.
Yeah. How can we practically bring about that kind of change, revolution? Do you need violence or total change of powers? Would that include just black consciousness? And how would everyone work together to do that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to not be afraid of revolution, because one of the things we're basically told revolution is bad, it's bloody, it's about violence, it's this, it's that. This is not what revolution is. Revolution is just saying that you have to build an alternative, effectively. One of the reasons why you get this focus on violence is because, look, the reality is the West is the most violent system that's ever existed on the face of the planet. And as I give you many examples of when you do try to change things, you just get lots of violence, right? So if you listen to someone like Malcolm or the Panthers or what they're arguing for violence is basically self-defense. Like, when you do these things, you're going to have to defend yourself because you will get violent. It's not the case that we're just going to go out and pick up violence. And actually, violence does not make something revolutionary. As I said, the West is the most violent system in the world. It's not revolutionary, right? So what revolution looks like is how do you build alternative economic institutions? How do you build alternative ways of doing things? I mean, if you're just thinking utopia, which is always good and bad, it's good to think what's the long term, but also we have to be practical. What does the African Revolution look like? It's a continent where Africa is the richest part of the world. I mean, it should be the richest place in the world given its resources. It is the poorest part of the world because of racism, right? So Africa is the only place that has all the resources, farmland, mineral wealth, etc., to basically take itself out of the world system, right? And just say, look, We're going to organise ourselves differently. We're going to keep the resources in the country. We're going to transform the way that we organise wealth and distribute that wealth. And we're going to have a society that benefits all of us and isn't about, you know, the wealth being extracted into Europe, etc., etc. And if that were to happen, capitalism ends tomorrow. Like, capitalism needs the exploitation of African resources. So if you can stop that from happening, then you have to have a different way of running the world, right? And to get that, it shouldn't be like that. Shouldn't be that complicated. That shouldn't take violence, but it might do because you get violence. But it's not about violence. It's about saying how do you organise differently. So what we should be doing is we should be planning and saying in the next 50 years, you know, can we be using the stuff that we have? Like, so for example, if you're going to have the African Revolution, you need development, right? So you need factories, you need infrastructure, you need roads, you need these things, right? The problem is the way that those things happen in Africa now is they happen very much under neo-colonial terms, which don't benefit Africa. It's about extracting wealth rather than importing it. So are there ways to subvert that to get these resources so they actually know, now we're building a factory here, now we're building roads that connect, now we're building the infrastructure that we need. I think it's possible. It just takes planning, it takes foresight, it takes organisation and unity. But yeah, this idea of black consciousness is essentially a starting point, because once you do that, you have to think of the world differently. You have to change the way that we create wealth generally. And so I think in terms of black revolution, it's always been, if you can organise Africa, then you use that power to say, well, actually, what can we do in Asia, what can we do in South America, etc., etc. Because right now, the truth is, black people ain't got no power. So I can say anything I want to say, it'll be nothing. But if you can organise a real economic base, then you can have the power to then say, actually, no, we can do things and change things and make it different.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Your talks for Year 12 and 13 were so interesting, and everyone really appreciated them. Like, I had so many people talking about afterwards. It was like, wow, that was so interesting. I literally didn't know about that. So, yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.